May 31st, 1915. 11:30 at night. A third-floor flat in a Chelsea tenement, London, England. The woman in the Chelsea tenement knew the sound before she understood what it meant. It was 11:30, and through the open window of her third-floor flat came a noise that belonged to no earthly machine she had ever encountered. Not the rattle of the omnibus, not the clatter of the underground, not even the distant rumble of artillery that occasionally drifted across the channel from France. This was something else entirely, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself, growing louder with each passing second. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, pulling back the blackout curtain just enough to peer into the London sky. What she saw there, silhouetted against the moon, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Hanging impossibly in the darkness like a leviathan from the depths of the sea, suspended by nothing but hydrogen and hubris, was a German Zeppelin, and from its belly, barely visible in the dim light, small dark objects began to fall. The woman opened her mouth to scream, but the first bomb struck 3 streets away before any sound could escape her throat. The age of aerial bombardment had arrived over London, and with it came a terror so profound that it would change the very nature of warfare forever. The sky, once a realm of clouds and birdsong, had become an avenue of death. Act 1. The unthinkable made real. 6 months earlier, in the wood-panelled chambers of the British War Office on Whitehall, the notion of German airships attacking London had been dismissed with the casual confidence that only those who had never witnessed true innovation could muster. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill himself had declared in October of 1914 that the Zeppelin is the special terror of the ignorant and the imaginative. The statement would age like milk left in summer Sunday. Around the polished mahogany table, military men whose strategic thinking had been forged in the Boer War and refined in the tradition-bound academies of Victorian England could not fathom that the Germans would dare, or even could dare, to bridge the North Sea with machines filled with flammable gas to drop explosives on civilian populations. It simply was not done. War was conducted between armies on battlefields, not against women and children in their beds. The technology itself seemed fantastical to those who had not studied it closely. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin had spent decades perfecting his rigid airship design, creating massive cigar-shaped vessels with aluminum frameworks covered in cotton fabric and divided into multiple gas cells filled with hydrogen. By 1915, the German Navy alone operated 13 Zeppelins, with the Army controlling an additional 7. Each vessel stretched between 500 and 600 feet in length, some as large as the Titanic stood tall. They could carry bomb loads of up to 4,400 pounds and reach altitudes that put them beyond the effective range of most British anti-aircraft guns of the period. Maximum ceiling for the LZ series Zeppelins approached 13,000 feet, while British defensive guns could barely reach 8,000. The mathematics of vulnerability were stark, yet British commanders clung to the belief that such raids would never materialize on any meaningful scale. This miscalculation rested on several assumptions, each of which would prove catastrophically wrong. First, British intelligence believed the German High Command would consider such raids strategically insignificant and therefore not worth the risk of losing valuable airships. Second, they assumed navigation over the North Sea at night would prove too difficult for accurate targeting. Third, and most damningly, they believed the British public would never accept such barbarism, and that international condemnation would force Germany to abandon the tactic. What these assumptions failed to account for was German desperation. By early 1915, the war on the Western Front had devolved into a grinding stalemate. Trench warfare consumed men and materiel at rates that stunned even the most pessimistic observers. Germany needed to open new fronts, to stretch British resources, to strike at the industrial and psychological heart of the enemy. The Zeppelin offered a weapon that could bypass the trenches entirely. The first raid came on January 19th, 1915. Two Zeppelins, the L3 and L4, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Hans Fritz and Kapitänleutnant Magnus von Platen respectively, departed from Fuhlsbüttel near Hamburg, with orders to attack coastal fortifications and military installations in England. Poor weather and navigation errors meant neither reached London. Instead, bombs fell on Great Yarmouth, King's Lynn, and several smaller Norfolk towns. 7 civilians died. Property damage totaled £7,700. By later standards, the raid was almost negligible. By the standards of January 1915, it was apocalyptic. For the first time in nearly a millennium, since the Norman conquest of 1066, foreign invaders had successfully attacked English soil. The psychological impact rippled through British society like a shockwave. Newspapers the following morning struggled to find language adequate to the moment. The Times wrote that a new and detestable form of warfare has been inaugurated by the enemy. The Daily Mail, never one for understatement, declared it baby-killing and demanded immediate retribution. But beneath the outrage lay something more primal and more powerful than anger. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes from realizing that the fundamental rules of existence have changed. English homes, English streets, English children were no longer safe behind the barrier of the Channel and the shield of the Royal Navy. The Germans had found a way to reach over, around, and above all traditional defences. Every subsequent raid would deepen that fear, transforming it from a shock into a constant, grinding anxiety that defined the British homefront experience for the remainder of the war. Through February, March, and April, the raids continued sporadically. Most struck coastal towns and caused relatively minor damage. British defences remained chaotic and uncoordinated. Anti-aircraft guns were few and poorly positioned. Searchlights were scarce and underpowered. Fighter aircraft of the period lacked the ceiling to reach the Zeppelins, and even when they did manage to climb high enough, their machine guns often failed to ignite the hydrogen cells. Standard ammunition simply punched small holes in the gas bags, allowing hydrogen to leak slowly rather than explode catastrophically. The airships seemed invulnerable, ghostly, untouchable. German crews began to believe in their own immortality, that they were knights of the air conducting a form of warfare that elevated them above the mud and blood of the trenches. On the German side, the raids were anything but glamorous. Crews endured hours of bone-chilling cold at high altitude, where temperatures regularly dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The cramped gondolas offered no heat, no toilets, no comfort of any kind. Men urinated into bottles and defecated into bags that they tossed overboard. Frostbite was common. Engine noise was deafening. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, primitive compass work, and glimpses of landmarks through gaps in the clouds. Over the black expanse of the North Sea, with no radio navigation aids and only the stars to guide them, Zeppelin commanders often had no precise idea where they were. Some crews became so disoriented that they bombed the wrong towns entirely, mistaking fishing villages for major ports or dropping their payloads harmlessly into empty fields because they believed they were over London when they were actually still over the countryside of Kent. The man who would change everything, who would transform the Zeppelin campaign from nuisance to nightmare, was Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Mathy. 33 years old, gaunt, intense, with dark eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, Mathy commanded the L-13, one of the newest and most capable Zeppelins in the German Navy's fleet. Unlike many of his fellow commanders, Mathy was not a romantic. He did not wax poetic about the nobility of flight or the beauty of war seen from above. He was a technician, a professional, a man who studied wind patterns and fuel consumption rates with the same cold focus he brought to calculating bomb trajectories. He kept meticulous logs of every raid, noting exactly which types of incendiary devices caused the most damage, which altitudes provided the best bombing accuracy, and which approach routes offered the greatest chance of evading British defences. In his diary, recovered after the war, Mathy wrote that, "Sentiment has no place in this work. We are instruments of state policy, nothing more. The English must be made to understand that their island is no longer inviolate." It was Mathy who first successfully navigated the full distance from Germany to London and back. On May 31st, 1915, he guided the L-13 across the North Sea, up the Thames estuary, and directly over the heart of the British capital. The bombs he dropped that night killed 7 people and caused £18,400 in property damage. More importantly, they shattered the psychological barrier that had protected Londoners' sense of security. If the Zeppelins could reach London once, they could reach it again, and again, and again. The woman in Chelsea, who had watched from her window, was one of thousands who suddenly understood that the war, previously a distant abstraction discussed in newspapers and debated in Parliament, had come home. The front line now ran through every street, every neighbourhood, every bedroom in the city. Act 2. The campaign intensifies. The summer and autumn of 1915 saw the Zeppelin raids escalate in frequency and ferocity. German Naval Airship Division expanded rapidly, commissioning new vessels at a pace that alarmed British intelligence. By September, the Germans operated 19 Zeppelins, with more under construction. The newer models, designated as R-class for the Navy and P-class for the Army, were larger, faster, and capable of carrying significantly heavier bomb loads than the earlier designs. The L-13, Mathy's ship, could carry 4,400 pounds of bombs. By contrast, the L-30, commissioned in May 1916, could carry 8,800 pounds. Bomb technology itself evolved. Early raids used a mixture of high-explosive and incendiary devices. The high-explosive bombs, typically weighing between 100 and 300 pounds, created blast craters and structural damage. The incendiary bombs, smaller but more numerous, were designed to start fires that would spread through the tightly packed neighbourhoods of industrial London. German commanders began to realise that fire was their most effective weapon. A single high-explosive bomb might destroy one building. A cluster of incendiaries could ignite an entire block. The cramped, ancient neighbourhoods of East London, with their wooden beams and thatched roofs, proved especially vulnerable. On the night of September 8, 1915, the largest raid yet struck the capital. 4 Zeppelins crossed the coastline and converged on London from different directions, dropping a total of 9,000 pounds of bombs. 22 people died. 87 were injured. Fires raged through Whitechapel and Shoreditch. The flames could be seen from Windsor, 20 miles to the west. Fire brigades, already stretched thin by wartime manpower shortages, struggled to contain the blazes. Some fires burned for 3 days. The human cost, measured in statistics, fails to capture the intimate horror of these attacks. Consider the family of Alfred and Elizabeth Coombs, who lived at 17 Clifton Street in Shoreditch. On the night of September 8th, Elizabeth had just put their 3 children to bed when she heard the familiar hum of approaching Zeppelin engines. She hurried to gather the children and rush them to the cellar, but a high-explosive bomb struck the house before they could reach safety. The building collapsed entirely. Rescue workers, digging through rubble by lamplight, found Elizabeth's body covering those of her 2 youngest children. She had thrown herself over them in the final seconds. All 3 were dead. Alfred, who worked night shifts at a munitions factory, came home at dawn to find his house reduced to a pile of bricks and splintered wood. His entire family was gone. He was one of thousands who experienced such losses during the campaign. British authorities initially tried to suppress information about the raids, fearing that publicity would create panic and damage morale. Newspapers were forbidden from identifying specific locations that had been bombed, leading to absurd euphemisms in which London became a city in the southeast and Liverpool became a northern port, casualty figures were downplayed or delayed. But word spread through neighborhoods faster than any censorship could contain. People talked. They saw the damage. They attended the funerals. The official policy of minimization only bred resentment and rumors, some of which were far more alarming than the truth. Stories circulated of hundreds dead, of entire neighborhoods obliterated, of German spies signaling to the Zeppelins with lights from rooftops. Some of these stories had grains of truth. Others were pure fantasy. All of them fed a growing atmosphere of paranoid vigilance. The government's response evolved slowly, hampered by bureaucratic inertia and competing priorities. Anti-aircraft guns increased in number, rising from 36 in July 1915 to 285 by the end of 1916. Searchlight batteries proliferated, creating cones of light that swept the night sky, searching for the telltale silhouette of a Zeppelin. A home defense squadron of aircraft was established, equipped with modified fighters that could, theoretically, climb high enough to intercept the raiders. But theory and practice diverged sharply. Pilots often spent hours circling in the darkness, burning precious fuel, never catching sight of their targets. When they did spot a Zeppelin, their guns frequently jammed in the freezing air. Even direct hits often failed to bring down the airships. Standard ammunition, as noted earlier, lacked the incendiary component needed to ignite hydrogen. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Lieutenant Commander Frank Brock of the Royal Navy, member of the famous Brock fireworks manufacturing family, developed a new type of ammunition that combined explosive, tracer, and incendiary elements. The Brock bullet, as it became known, would punch through the fabric covering of a Zeppelin, ignite the hydrogen inside, and turn the entire airship into a fireball. The first successful use came on the night of September 2nd, 1916, when Lieutenant William Leefe Robinson engaged the German Army airship SL-11 over Cuffley in Hertfordshire. Robinson emptied 3 drums of ammunition into the vessel before it finally caught fire. The Zeppelin, fully engulfed, fell like a meteor, burning the entire way down. It crashed in a field, killing all 16 crew members instantly. Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross. Crowds of Londoners, watching from the streets, cheered as the airship burned. For the first time since the campaign began, the Zeppelins seemed mortal. But the Germans adapted. New Zeppelins flying at higher altitudes, some reaching 19,000 feet, put them beyond the effective range of most fighters. Crews wore primitive oxygen equipment, leather masks connected to cumbersome cylinders, though the systems were unreliable, and many men suffered from hypoxia symptoms including hallucinations and impaired judgment. Heinrich Mathy, now celebrated in Germany as a hero, continued to lead the most daring raids. On the night of September 23, 1916, he commanded a massive assault involving 12 Zeppelins. The raid killed 40 people and caused £130,000 in damage. Mathy's own ship, the L-13, dropped incendiaries that started fires visible across half of London. But his luck was running out. British defences were improving with each raid. More guns, more searchlights, more fighters, and more Brock bullets. October 1st, 1916, was a cold, clear night with good visibility. Mathy departed from Germany aboard his new command, the L-31, the largest and most advanced Zeppelin yet constructed, 660 feet long, capable of reaching 20,000 feet, armed with the latest bombs and navigational equipment. Mathy crossed the North Sea with confidence born from 25 successful raids, but over London he encountered resistance unlike anything he had previously faced. Searchlights locked onto his position. Anti-aircraft fire burst around him with unnerving accuracy. He climbed, pushing the L-31 to maximum altitude, but Lieutenant Woolstan, Tempest in a BE-2 Sea fighter, managed to climb alongside. At 16,000 feet, freezing, struggling for breath, Tempest opened fire with incendiary ammunition. The rounds tore through the L-31's fabric skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small flame appeared near the stern. Then another. Then the entire aft section erupted. Mathy, realizing his ship was doomed, climbed out onto the ladder of the gondola and jumped. His body was found in a crater in Potter's Bar. He had fallen over 16,000 feet. Whether he jumped to escape the flames or fell during the ship's death plunge, no one would ever know. The L-31 crashed in a massive fireball that could be seen from 50 miles away. The death of Heinrich Mathy marked the beginning of the end for the Zeppelin offensive against Britain. He had been the campaign's most successful and feared commander, responsible for more damage than any other individual pilot. His loss sent shockwaves through German Naval Airship Division. Other experienced commanders had also been killed. The L-33 had been forced down and captured intact on September 23rd, giving British intelligence a complete understanding of Zeppelin construction and vulnerability points. German High Command began to question whether the strategic value of the raids justified the losses. Each Zeppelin cost approximately 500,000 marks to build and required months of construction time. Each trained crew took years to develop. The casualty rate was becoming unsustainable. Of the 84 Zeppelins built during the war, 60 were destroyed. 389 crewmen died. For these losses, the Zeppelins killed a total of 557 British civilians and injured 1,358 more. The ratio of investment to effect was becoming untenable. Act 3. Transformation and Legacy. By early 1917, the Zeppelin campaign had effectively ended, not through decisive defeat but through gradual obsolescence. The Germans shifted to conventional bomber aircraft, Gotha heavy bombers and later Giants, which could carry similar bomb loads while being faster, more maneuverable, and far less vulnerable than the hydrogen-filled airships. The daylight raids that followed in mid-1917 killed more people in single attacks than the entire Zeppelin campaign. But the Zeppelins had already accomplished their most significant impact, and that impact was not measured in tonnage of bombs dropped or buildings destroyed. The Zeppelins had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare and the relationship between civilians and combat. Before the Zeppelin raids, the concept of strategic bombing barely existed. Civilians in warring nations lived with the knowledge that their sons and husbands might die in battle, but maintained the comforting assumption that the fighting would remain distant, contained within designated battlefields far from home. The Zeppelins shattered that assumption. They demonstrated that modern technology could erase the distinction between soldier and civilian, between battlefield and home front. Every city, every town, every home became a potential target. This realization produced a psychological transformation that rippled through British society in ways both obvious and subtle. Blackout regulations, originally voluntary and sporadically observed, became mandatory and rigidly enforced. Air raid sirens, previously non-existent, became part of urban soundscape. Shelters, both public and private, proliferated. A whole architecture of fear was constructed, literally and figuratively. The social impact cut deeper than physical preparations. Class distinctions, always sharp in Edwardian and Georgian Britain, took on new dimensions during the raids. The wealthy could afford reinforced cellar shelters. They could evacuate to country estates. They could send their children to relatives in safe areas. The poor had none of these options. Working-class families in the East End, living in overcrowded tenements with no cellars and no transportation, simply had to endure. The Zeppelins dropped their bombs without regard for social class, but the consequences of those bombs fell disproportionately on those least able to protect themselves. This inequity did not go unnoticed. Labour politicians used the raids as evidence of systemic injustice, arguing that if the rich demanded protection, the poor deserved equal security. The Zeppelin campaign thus became, indirectly, a catalyst for social reform. The military lessons were absorbed more quickly in Germany than in Britain, ironically. German planners recognized that strategic bombing offered a way to bypass trench warfare entirely, to strike at the industrial and civilian infrastructure that supported enemy armies. This insight, learned through the Zeppelin campaigns, would inform German strategy in World War II. The Blitz of 1940 to 1941, when the Luftwaffe bombed London for 57 consecutive nights, killing over 43,000 people, was a direct descendant of the Zeppelin raids. The technology had evolved from hydrogen-filled airships to high-speed bombers, but the strategic concept remained identical: target the enemy's home front, destroy their factories, break their civilian morale, force capitulation without ever defeating their armies in the field. Britain, too, learned. The Royal Air Force, formed in April 1918 through the merger of the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, was created partly in response to German air raids. British bomber development accelerated. By 1918, Britain had its own strategic bombing force targeting German industrial centres. The ethics of such bombing remained contentious. Sir Hugh Trenchard, Chief of the Air Staff, argued that moral effect of bombing stands undoubtedly to the material effect in a proportion of 20-1. Others, including many members of Parliament and clergy, denounced strategic bombing as barbarism that reduced civilized nations to the level of their enemies. These debates, first sparked by the Zeppelin raids, have never been fully resolved. They echo through Guernica, Dresden, Hiroshima, and every bombing campaign since. The technology itself became obsolete remarkably quickly. By 1920, no military power considered rigid airships viable weapons of war. The vulnerability demonstrated so dramatically over Britain, combined with several peacetime disasters, including the British R-101 crash in 1930 that killed 48 people, ended the era of the giant airship. Zeppelins continued as passenger transport through the 1930s, culminating in the elegant luxury of the Hindenburg, but even that came to a fiery end on May 6, 1937, in Lakehurst, New Jersey. The hydrogen that had once carried bombs over London consumed the Hindenburg in less than 40 seconds. 36 people died. The age of the airship was over, yet its shadow remained. In the decades following World War I, survivors of the Zeppelin raids struggled to articulate what they had experienced. The trauma had no precedent, no vocabulary, no framework for understanding. Soldiers returning from the trenches suffered shell shock, a recognized if poorly understood condition. But what did you call the psychological damage inflicted by sitting helplessly in your home while bombs fell randomly from the sky? There was no diagnosis, no treatment, no acknowledgement. Many who lived through the raids developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder: anxiety at loud noises, inability to sleep, constant vigilance, nightmares of falling bombs and burning buildings. These symptoms often persisted for years, sometimes for life, unrecognized and untreated. Ethel Bilbrough, the woman in Chelsea who witnessed the May 31st raid, lived until 1973. In an interview given shortly before her death, she recalled that night with crystalline clarity. "You must understand," she said, her voice still carrying the accent of Edwardian London despite decades in Australia where she emigrated after the war. "We had no conception that such things were possible. War was something that happened to soldiers, far away. The idea that a machine could fly across the sea and drop explosives on our homes was simply unimaginable. When I saw that Zeppelin hanging in the sky, my first thought was not fear but disbelief. It seemed like something from a Jules Verne novel, not real life. Even when the bombs started falling, part of my mind refused to accept it was happening. That sense of unreality stayed with me for years. I think it stayed with all of us who lived through it. We had seen the future, and it was terrible. The strategic assessment of the Zeppelin campaign has evolved considerably over the past century. Contemporary British analysis dismissed the raids as militarily insignificant nuisances that achieved nothing except to stiffen British resolve. German analysis was similarly dismissive, viewing the campaign as a costly failure that diverted resources from more important fronts. Modern historians take a more nuanced view. While the material damage was indeed limited, approximately £3 million in property destruction and fewer than 600 dead, the psychological and strategic impacts were profound. The raids forced Britain to divert significant resources to home defence, including anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and fighter squadrons that might otherwise have served in France. They pioneered tactics and technologies that would dominate aerial warfare for the next century. Perhaps most significantly, they demolished forever the notion that civilians could remain insulated from the conflicts of their nations. The moral dimension remains the most troubling and unresolved aspect of the Zeppelin legacy. Were the raids war crimes? By the standards of 1915, the question barely made sense. International law regarding aerial bombardment was essentially non-existent. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had established rules for land and naval warfare, but aviation was too new to have been addressed. German commanders argued with some justification that they targeted military and industrial facilities and that civilian casualties were incidental. British commanders made identical arguments when they later bombed German cities. Both sides were lying, or at least engaging in convenient self-deception. The reality, documented in bombing logs and damage assessments, is that both sides targeted urban areas with the full knowledge that civilians would die. They did so not through bloodlust but through cold calculation. Killing civilians would, they believed, break enemy morale and hasten the end of the war. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong, a fact that should have been obvious but somehow was not. Bombing did not break British morale during World War I. It did not break British morale during the Blitz of World War II. It did not break German morale when Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble. It did not break Japanese morale even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose populations were already resigned to defeat. Strategic bombing, the doctrine born in the Zeppelin raids over London, has never achieved its promised goal of breaking civilian will. Instead, it tends to solidify resistance, to unite populations against the attackers, to transform military conflicts into total wars of survival. The Zeppelin crews who flew through the frozen darkness over the North Sea, enduring cold and fear and the constant possibility of being shot down in flames, believed they were conducting rational military operations. They were, instead, pioneering a form of warfare whose ultimate lesson was its own futility. Epilogue: The Memory of Fire. On a grey afternoon in November 1972, a ceremony took place in Potter's Bar, on the site where Heinrich Mathy died. A small plaque was unveiled, marking the location where the L-31 had crashed 56 years earlier. Representatives from both Britain and Germany attended. Veterans of both air forces stood together, old men now, their wars long over. One of them, a former RAF pilot who had flown defensive patrols during the raids, though he never encountered a Zeppelin, said something that captured the strange ambiguity of the event. "We were enemies once," he said. "We tried to kill each other. That was our duty. But we were also young men doing what our countries asked of us. Mathy was a brave man and a skilled airman. That he dropped bombs on British cities does not erase those facts. That we shot him down does not make us murderers. We were all caught in something larger than ourselves, something we barely understood even as we fought it." The Zeppelin raids killed 557 British civilians across 51 separate attacks between January 1915 and August 1918. These numbers are precise, documented, verified. They are also utterly inadequate to convey the experience they represent. Behind each number was a person with a name, a life, a family, dreams that would never be fulfilled, children who would never be born. Behind the numbers were also the survivors, thousands of them, who carried the memory of fire falling from the sky for the rest of their lives. The physical scars of the raids have long since been rebuilt, bombed buildings replaced, crater-filled streets repaved. The psychological scars proved more durable. In the end, the Zeppelin campaign stands as a threshold moment, a hinge on which the door of modern warfare swung open. Before the Zeppelins, war retained at least the fiction of being a limited activity conducted between professional armies on designated battlefields. After the Zeppelins, that fiction could no longer be maintained. War had become total, unlimited, a condition that encompassed entire societies. This transformation was neither sudden nor complete. Elements of it existed before 1915, but the Zeppelins made it visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. When those giant airships appeared in the London sky, silent and menacing as storm clouds, they brought more than bombs. They brought a message. The message was simple and terrible. No one is safe. Nowhere is sanctuary. War recognizes no boundaries. We live in the world the Zeppelins made. Every time an air raid siren sounds in Ukraine or Gaza or Yemen, every time civilians huddle in shelters while explosives fall from above, every time military planners calculate acceptable collateral damage, the ghost of those hydrogen-filled leviathans hovers in the background. The technology has evolved beyond anything Count von Zeppelin could have imagined. Precision-guided munitions, stealth bombers, drone strikes launched from continents away, but the fundamental logic, the basic calculus, remains unchanged. The sky is a weapon. Civilians are targets. Distance provides no protection. These principles, shocking and revolutionary in 1915, are now so thoroughly normalized that we barely notice them. That normalization is perhaps the Zeppelins' most lasting and most disturbing legacy. The woman in Chelsea, Ethel Bilbrough, said one more thing in that final interview before her death. The interviewer asked if she hated the Germans for what they had done. She thought for a long moment before answering. "I hated them then," she said. "When the bombs were falling and my neighbours were dying, yes, I hated them. But hatred is exhausting. You cannot maintain it forever. Eventually, you come to understand that the men in those Zeppelins were not monsters. They were young men following orders, scared and cold and far from home, trying to survive. Just like our boys in the trenches. Just like my own son, who died at Passchendaele. The real enemy was not the Germans. The real enemy was the war itself, the great machine that fed on all of us, British and German alike. The Zeppelins were just one more gear in that machine. Understanding that does not make what happened any less terrible, but it makes it comprehensible. And perhaps that is the most we can ask from history. Not that it provide easy answers, but that it help us comprehend the terrible things we do to each other, in the hope that comprehension might, someday, help us stop. The Zeppelin raids ended more than a century ago. The last veteran died decades past. The physical evidence has largely vanished, replaced by the unrelenting march of urban development. But the raids themselves live on, not as history but as prophecy. They showed us what we were capable of, what we would become. They revealed that the human capacity for innovation and the human capacity for destruction are not separate things but two aspects of the same drive. The same engineering genius that could build machines to lift men into the sky could build machines to rain death from above. The same organizational skill that could coordinate the navigation of giant airships across the North Sea could coordinate the firebombing of cities. The same human beings who could create beauty and art and love could also drop bombs on sleeping children and call it military necessity. On clear nights in London, when the moon is bright and the city lights dim, you can still imagine them. Giant shapes hanging in the darkness, silent and inexorable as fate. You can imagine the hum of their engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the roar of distant explosions. You can imagine the fear that gripped an entire population when they realized that the sky, which had always meant freedom and possibility, had become a threat. The Zeppelins are gone. But what they represented, what they inaugurated, remains. The age of aerial bombardment that began on that winter night in January 1915 continues still. It will continue until we find the wisdom and the will to end it. Until then, we all live beneath the shadow of those first giant airships, carrying their cargo of fire into the night. The bombs are still falling. We have simply learned to ignore the sound of their descent. That too is part of the Zeppelin legacy. The normalization of the unthinkable, the acceptance of the unacceptable, the slow, steady erosion of the boundaries that once separated war from peace, soldier from civilian, battlefield from home. The Zeppelins taught us that these boundaries were always illusions. Whether we have learned anything useful from that terrible lesson remains, more than a century later, an open and agonizing question.